Welcome back, everybody. So, there is not much time left for the rest of the year, and there are still several units to cover. And therefore, I'm going to try to give you very brief overviews of all of those units, starting with this one today, the Civil Rights Movement. Now, when we're talking about the Civil Rights Movement, this might refer to something that's still ongoing. But in the history class, and in Chapter 30, which is the assigned reading for this unit, the Civil Rights Movement refers to a particular political, legal, and social struggle, predominantly for African Americans to gain their full citizenship rights in the United States once and for all. The beginning of it can stretch back, really to the 1600s potentially, but more likely you're talking about the post-Civil War period when Reconstruction ends through the 1950s and 60s when legislation is passed to give at least a baseline of equal citizenship to African Americans and other minorities too. So in this unit, we're going to talk about the goals of this movement. We're going to talk about the methodology of this movement. We're going to talk about some of the successes, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And we're also going to discuss some of the lasting issues and some of the ways that you might hear the spirit of the civil rights movement brought forth in media and in academia still today. So before we actually discuss any of the historical events or people, I would like to discuss something conceptual about the title, civil rights. What does that actually mean? Essentially, there are 5 basic categories of human rights. And civil rights generally refers to the right to be treated as an equal to anyone else in society. This might be considered in distinction to political rights, which would refer to the right to participate in elections, voting, right to run for office, the freedom of speech and to obtain information. Economic rights, the right to participate in an economy that benefits you, or all people, and to the right to desirable work. Social rights, the right to education, healthcare, food, clothing, and other kind of services. And cultural rights, the right to freedom of religion, to speak the language and practice the culture of one's choice. Now, I actually color-coded this slide because the red ones, the civil and political rights, are the primary focus of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, the period of history that we're going to talk about. The blue ones, the social and cultural rights, could be said to describe the more current issues of human rights ambition today. The economic rights are purple because they're shared by both of those time periods. So, unfortunately, trying to make an economy that benefits everybody has been a problem throughout human history. So the economic aspirations are shared by both time periods. So the goals of this particular time period were, of course, equality. Now, what does that mean? In this case, it's defined by a couple of particular contexts. There were particular social injustices that African Americans and others sought to end. For example, terrorist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan we'll talk about that had, in many instances, infiltrated the criminal justice system in positions of sheriff and police officer to judge and lawyer. This was all part of the system of segregation that we're going to discuss today. In addition to a segregated society, which we'll get into what that means, African Americans and others aspired to have equal voting rights that had been denied to them for several generations in America. One more note about defining segregation. You've probably heard this term before. I just want to bring up that there are 2 kinds of segregation. You may have heard these terms before too. On one hand, we have de facto segregation. Now, this means segregation that just happens because of people's choices. People very often prefer to live in and go to school with people that look and speak the same language as they do. And therefore, you have a kind of natural segregation that often happens. Not always, but often happens in places. Now, this is in great distinction to the kind of segregation that we're going to talk about in this unit, which was de jure segregation. And that is segregation that is sanctioned by law. In this case, we're referring to the Jim Crow system. And this is what characterized the South after the election of 1876, which was virtually a tie and was resolved by agreeing to withdraw Northern forces from the South, thus ending Reconstruction. This system was named after a minstrel show character. I'll talk to you about what that means in a second. And really fed upon the most denigrating and worst stereotypes and other just dehumanizing behaviors, treatments, and attitudes towards African Americans throughout American history. The Jim Crow system was codified, that means officially indoctrinated into law, by the Plessy v. Ferguson decision of 1896, which found that the segregation that was happening in passenger train cars, dividing seats up between black cars and white cars, was constitutional, that it met the standard of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. So this basically approved segregation, which would then persist in the South for many decades. Here we can see an example of a segregated drinking fountain on a county courthouse lawn in Halifax, North Carolina. This was typical to see facilities labeled colored and white in the southern United States. And almost invariably, the conditions of the facilities were unequal. Another disturbing aspect of American history and culture of the time is the existence of things like minstrel shows. This is a poster, a primary source, from around 1910 that advertises a minstrel show called All Coons Look Alike to Me. Now, what these minstrel shows involved was taking white actors and taking a piece of cork that you would get out of a wine bottle, let's say, and setting it on fire, melting it down, and using the remnants to paint your face black. And then the white actors would paint their lips with very, very wide red lipstick and basically go make buffoons out of themselves. And this was considered a comedy show. This was another example of just the disturbingly denigrating culture that existed towards African Americans at the time. So what I hope you have already learned about segregation is that this existed across a vast array of public and private spaces, particularly in the southern United States. But African Americans had separate schools, busing, transportation, restaurants, parks, and with those segregated facilities came inequitable funding. And this usually left African American facilities neglected and in need of repair. The two other really important features of the Jim Crow system were disenfranchisement, and what that means is that voting rights were actively being denied to members of the African American community at this time, and other minorities as well. And this was true of all southern states between the period of 1890 and 1910. There were things like poll taxes. There were things like literacy tests or intelligence tests that were only given to African Americans and not given to other citizens to prevent them from being qualified or being registered to vote. The second characteristic was discrimination. And this you already know about. You've heard about this, and we just did this in the last unit as part of the foundational reasons for the unrest in Newark by 1967. So let's talk about some of the methods that were employed by various leaders of the civil rights movement. The method that probably doesn't get as much attention as the civil disobedience is the challenges through the court system. And that would be led by the first African American to ever become a Supreme Court justice, and that's Thurgood Marshall. So he headed the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and they sued governments in various places in the South and challenged many of those forms of discrimination that existed. The most important legal precedent used in these challenges was the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. So this was an amendment passed after the Civil War that guarantees that all people have to face an inequality of due process before law. And that was used to overturn a lot of these laws that segregated society. In particular, the most famous desegregation case, the landmark ruling as it's called, is Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. And in this case, it was demonstrated that segregated facilities, segregated schooling, was inherently unequal, that it was by its very nature unequal, not just in funding and resources, but psychologically. The separation of society had impacts on African American children that were in some ways immeasurable. And this was demonstrated actually in the courtroom through the testimony of various psychologists. And here we see one of the actual primary sources of the time, a kind of rally poster to try to desegregate schools, to use busing to actually integrate school systems. But this was very, very unpopular, especially in the South. By 1955, there was a massive resistance in the South to school desegregation in particular. So teachers that supported it were chased out of schools. There was terror tactics used. The KKK was involved, and we'll get into that more in a second. Boycotting of integrated education was all used to try to disrupt the desegregation. Now, the most famous incident happened in 1957, where 9 black students had to be escorted by the National Guard. President Eisenhower had to order in the National Guard to escort 9 black students into Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. And this is known as the Little Rock Nine. These students successfully attended and with the great threat of violence actually did successfully desegregate the schools in Arkansas, but there were crowds gathered waiting to attack these students. Almost unthinkable to some, this was actually the norm. And to some in the South, they might say, maybe in places this still is the norm. What we saw in the 1950s and 60s was a huge growth of the Ku Klux Klan in America. This was a response to desegregation. Many white Americans felt that desegregation would be the downfall of the United States. By empowering the former slaves, you were essentially empowering the rebels and kicking out the ruling class. And this is an attitude that sounds more like the way that civil rights are talked about today. We'll get to that a little bit later. Anyway, violence against blacks rose sharply in the 1950s and 60s. Although in the South it was not always reported, it has been argued that it's been heavily underreported due to the kind of KKK presence and the element of racism in many Southern institutions and policing organizations that were responsible for reporting this information. Incidentally, New Jersey had a very large Klan membership. This was more true around the period closer to World War II because Nazism and the KKK had united and actually had a headquarters in Andover, New Jersey, where they used to hold summer camps every year. But typically, the Klan membership of the North was not nearly as violent as the Klans of the South, which used a lot more of the burning crosses and terrorism type of intimidation. But here we can see a picture from Oxford, New Jersey, which is out in western New Jersey. And this picture was taken in 2003, and it shows a Klan rally going on. And you can see this lovely, lovely gentleman holding his hand up in the Sieg Heil position. So you can see that this still exists. You know, this isn't that long ago. All right, so I'm going to run out of time. I'm going to have to break this into 2 parts. There's one more instance of violence that I just need to bring up because it helps to inspire the civil rights movement. It's so disturbing that Rosa Parks actually said this is one of the main reasons she refused to give up her seat. And that's the murder of Emmett Till. In 1955, a 14-year-old boy from Chicago was visiting his grandmother in Mississippi when he went to the general store. The story goes he whistled at a white woman, although he had a lisp and it may have been a tragic misunderstanding. But the woman went home and told her husband that she had been whistled at by a black boy. The husband got his brother and they kidnapped, tortured, and murdered Emmett Till. They gouged his eyes out, they wrapped him in barbed wire, and they left him in the river. The killers were acquitted on the charges by white jurors, and after the trial they admitted that they had murdered him. And this helped to motivate the civil rights movement, partially because the grandmother held an open casket funeral and made it national news. It's one of the most horrible stories, but it's also one of the most inspirational stories, as we'll see next time. Take care, everybody.